everybody was unhappy with each other. It was so much better in the 1950s or the 1850s or 1808. Well, in Washington, I sit at Henry Clay's desk. So I decided I would read more about Henry Clay. So I started reading about Henry Clay, and I was reading this book the other day, and he was elected in 1808 at like 26 or 25 to Congress, first time. And you know what? They elected him Speaker first term. So Warren, you got a lot to live up to. First term. It's the only time it's ever happened. He became Speaker of the House in his first term. And, what was it like? Was it a calm place? Well, they had just invented the Derringer, and most of the congressmen carried one. Most of the congressmen carried canes, not for walking, but for hitting other congressmen over the head with it. So when he was elected, there was this congressman from Virginia, John Randolph of Roanoke, and he had two big hunting dogs that he brought on the floor with him. And when you think hunting dogs, don't think like Labrador Retriever. Think of the hunting dogs from the Game of Thrones, all right? Mean, nasty hunting dogs that would like to eat you for lunch, all right? So he had him on the floor, and the previous Speaker of the House wanted to get rid of him, but he was afraid of the guy. Some congressman from North Carolina stood up and said, "You need to get those damn dogs off the floor." He hit him over the head with a cane. He beat him senseless with his cane because he said he was dogs. So Henry Clay got to be Speaker at like 26, and he told the Sergeant of the Arms, "Get those damn dogs off the floor." So they did, and John Randolph of Roanoke was not very happy. He was standing outside the doors, the same doors that we walk out of now, and he was standing out. He was all puffed up, and he said, "I never sidestep a skunk." And Henry Clay walked quickly around him, and says, "I always do." So if you think that it was more civil then than it is now, it was rough and tumble. Read about Jefferson and Adams fighting back and forth. Adams passes the Alien and Sedition Act, and he puts a congressman in jail, a guy by the name of Matthew Lyons. He was in jail for 3 months, ran for re-election, and won from jail. Matthew Lyons was also, he's most famous for being elected from jail and opposing the Alien and Sedition Act, but he was also called the Spitting Lion because he got into a fight with another congressman and they were spitting in the face. We don't do that anymore. I promise you. It's sort of, you say the media misleads you. They've misled you on this. Sure, we have different beliefs. We're at odds. And there's occasionally heated debate, but there really hadn't been any violence. In fact, I've seen more Republican on Republican violence than I have Republican on Democrat violence. Your family you tend to have a little stronger disagreements with. But Henry Clay and this John Randolph, their feud went on for years and years. 15 years later, Henry Clay runs for president against Andrew Jackson. John Quincy Adams in there. There is no majority. And so it goes to the House. If there's no majority in the Electoral College, the decision goes to the House. Well, Henry Clay had placed fourth, but he kind of wanted to be Secretary of State because you often went from Secretary of State to presidency. And so he threw his lot in with John Quincy Adams. And even though Andrew Jackson won the majority, and they weren't very happy, Andrew Jackson, all his followers called it a corrupt bargain. Henry Clay became Secretary of State and threw his support to John Quincy Adams. But John Randolph, from 16 years before, went to the Senate floor and called Henry Clay a scoundrel and a blackleg. And I was like, what does that mean? What is a blackleg? And so I had to look it up, and it means that you were like a card shark. You were a cheater at cards. And Henry Clay did a lot of things, and most of them he'd own up to. He was a little bit of a womanizer. He was a little bit of a drinker. He was a little bit of a gambler. But he damn sure didn't want you to call him a cheater. And so he challenged John Randolph to a duel. They went across the Potomac, and they fought a duel. That was Henry Clay's second duel. And so you ask yourself, the guy fights a duel in the State House. Yes, Damon, they were fighting them in the State House also, but they did cross the Ohio because it was illegal. Do you know in Kentucky we still have to sign an oath saying we haven't fought in a duel before we can serve in office? And now I think you can't even go across the river anymore. We used to go across to Ohio Indiana to just fight over there, but you can't fight. So Henry Clay, who fought 2 duels, one in the State House, made him very famous before he became senator. And then he fights this other one. He's been up there 20 some odd years. But what do they call Henry Clay? The great compromiser. We got a different definition of compromise now than we used to have. So I get to sit at his desk. And it's the same desk, passed down from, probably 1815 or whenever he got back into the Senate. And so I'd been up there a week or two, and one of the other senators kind of looked at me and kind of smiled, a sly little smile, and said, "Will you be the great compromiser? Will you be a great compromiser?" And I think he was, thinking, well, this guy's probably not going to ever compromise on anything. Because I ran on a campaign saying there are things you got to believe in and certain things you shouldn't compromise on. But I gave my first speech. The first speech is sort of said to be an important speech in the Senate. So I gave my first speech on compromise. And I compared Henry Clay to Cassius Clay. And Henry Clay was the great compromiser. They teach in your history books, they say, well, he compromised to save the Union. Perhaps, and I think that was his intent. But you could also say that maybe all of his compromises ultimately led to the dissolution of the Union. Depends on your point of view. He kept compromising, but what were his compromises over? His compromise was to say, well, half the country could own another human. Are there some things that you think we shouldn't compromise on? Now, people say, oh, well, we live in a different time. We have different sensibilities. It's easy to be against slavery and against owning people. We have issues of our time. Are you willing to compromise on the life of the unborn? Are you willing to compromise on your religious liberty? Are you willing to compromise on the freedom of speech, the freedom of association, your right to bear arms, your right to have the government not come into your house without a justified legal warrant signed by a judge? Are we willing to compromise on those things? So frankly, I think there are times we shouldn't compromise. I think slavery was one. And so I compared Henry Clay to Cassius Clay. Cassius Clay also lived in Kentucky, and it's who the boxer was named after. He was a great abolitionist. He sort of had some struggles with Henry Clay, and at one point he sends a letter to Henry Clay, and actually reveals a letter of Henry Clay's where Henry Clay was implying that he might be for emancipation, but that was a step too far for Henry Clay, and he got really mad at Cassius Clay, and they never spoke again. But Cassius Clay printed a newspaper, and in his newspaper, it was an abolitionist newspaper, or maybe an emancipationist, there's a slight difference, newspaper, but it was a dangerous thing to do. So he produced it out of his house. Anybody ever been down to his house? It's a Whitehall down near Richmond. He produced it, but it was so dangerous that he had a cannon in the foyer, and he had loaded rifles at every window in case people broke in to try to burn the house or burn down the abolitionist press. He was a pretty tough guy, too. He fought 6 duels. One time he was coming through a little area of Lexington called Levittown, and he was bushwhacked and beat up by a group of people called Squire Turner and his boys. And they were slave traders. So Cassius Clay is coming through there. They've got him on the ground. They're beating him. They've taken his Bowie knife. He was famous for a big Bowie knife. They've taken his knife from him. They're beating him. And Tom Turner, Squire Turner's son, puts the gun to his head and fires 3 times. Good thing about living in the 19th century, and the guns didn't work quite as well. It backfired every time, and so he didn't die. But about the time the 3rd bullet misfires, he grabs the blade of the knife with his hand, cuts himself to the bone, and he was a tough guy, wrestles the knife away, and stabs Tom Turner in the gut and kills him. And all the rest of them ran off. Cassius Clay wasn't much for compromise. But the real question is, are there times you compromise? Is it everything we're not going to compromise? Or there's some things you compromise on and some things you frankly don't? I think the Bill of Rights, I think our natural God-given liberty that was given to us, we shouldn't compromise over. I'm just not willing to compromise on that.
Yeah.
But are there compromises? Yes. We need to reform Social Security. The only way you're going to save it is you've got to raise the age of eligibility. I'm not happy to tell you it, but that is the answer. You have to raise the age for my generation, for Warren's generation. It's going to have to fix it. But if Warren says we've got to raise it over 30 years and I say 20 years, could we split the difference and do it 25? That's compromise. But doing nothing is not compromise. Putting our head in the sand like the Democrats do running around like my opponent's doing now on television and using the traditional Medicare ad, Social Security ad that Republicans don't like the elderly, don't like poor people, that's not an answer. But that's what we have in Washington. So there really isn't even any compromise. I think there's been one bill, and it's mine, to fix Social Security, one bill to fix Medicare. Even in the Republican caucus, you know what they tell me? They say it's okay to talk about entitlement reform, but don't put it on paper. Don't put it into a bill because they'll come back and attack you. And sure enough, my opponent's saying he wants to raise the age, he wants to means test. I don't want to do any of those things, but I also don't want it to go bankrupt. And I don't want all the poor people in our country who live on Social Security to have a 25% cut. And so, frankly, if you have the alternative, if we say we're going to tax you a whole bunch more now to fix Social Security, or we're going to take away or have a little bit less benefits on the tail end, frankly, I'd rather have a little bit less benefits on the tail end than raising our taxes to 40% for working folks now. It'll cripple the economy if we do that. So I think there are things that you can compromise on, and maybe some things that you shouldn't compromise on. When we look at the problems up there, though, and we say, people ask me, what's the worst thing President Obama has done to the country? And I say, well, how long do you have? It's a long list. But it really isn't Obamacare. It isn't Dodd-Frank. And if you've heard me more than once, anytime in the last 6 years, you'll hear, I don't really spend a whole lot of time talking about the specifics of Obamacare and healthcare, wonkiness and all that stuff. Yeah, there's a whole lot of discussion about that, and it's a terrible plan. It's bad for us, bad for Kentucky. But really, if you want to sum it all up in a general statement, what President Obama has done to the country is the collapse of the separation of powers. One of the things our founders understood was that power was a problem, that power corrupts, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And what they did is they tried to disperse that power. First thing they did is they didn't want to have a king. That was probably one of the most important parts of the Constitutional Convention. They did not want a king. There was much debate on how long we would have a president for and what the powers would be, but they did not want a king. And it was part of a tradition. Some people think that the American Revolution was an abrupt change. No, it was part of a tradition. I mean, the British people had been struggling to rein in the power of the king since the Magna Carta. As my wife says, you're not supposed to say the Magna Carta. Since Magna Carta. I don't know why there's no preposition. 1215, the barons gather at Runnymede and they restrict the power of the king. They fought 2 civil wars in the 17th century before we get to our Civil War, our American Revolution, all fighting to restrict the power of the king. One of the things that we were luckiest about when we fought our revolution is that we didn't give up on our religious bearing. We didn't give up on our Christian beliefs. We didn't give up on the belief in assembly, and we had continuous assembly. And I can't tell you how important it is to have that backbone and those base beliefs upon everything else is based, because like the House of Burgess, the legislature in Virginia had been meeting since like 1630, all the way through our revolution, and continue to meet. It's incredibly important that we have that. Why is it important? Well, we have people, naive people, let's just call them Hillary Clinton, who think that if you go to Libya and you topple a dictator there, that they're going to elect Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson does not live in Libya. Neither do any of his ideas thrive. They are foreign to that land. So one of the things I'm trying to emphasize is how lucky we are that we had this tradition in our country, which was originally a British tradition, but of limiting power. In the Middle East, they know none of that. So when you topple a dictator in the Middle East, you either get another one or you maybe get something worse. And that's what's been happening. And it gets back to my good friend Rob Gibbons' point. Served 27 years in the military. And Lloyd Rogers and others who have served in the military. It is our responsibility before we send any young man and woman to war that we debate it and open and we declare it as the Constitution mandated.
We're here. We're here.
In fact, I think there is no greater responsibility. I mean, we can debate the budget all day long and we can have disagreements, but when you're sending someone to war, that is incredibly important. But we haven't done our job in a long time. We're not doing it. We went to war in Libya without any vote in Congress. President Obama ran on this message. It's about the only thing I agreed with him on, and I try to compliment people when I can find agreement. President Obama said when he ran for office that no president shall unilaterally go to war without congressional authority unless we're under imminent attack. And that's right. That's the way the Constitution stands. There is a provision, there has to be, if missiles are being launched from a carrier off Virginia, that a president can respond. We've actually never had that situation, to tell you the truth. But when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, the president came and they voted unanimously. People say, oh, Congress can't do anything. The day after Pearl Harbor, we voted nearly unanimously to go to war with Japan. When we were attacked on 9/11, and look, I hate war about as much as anybody you'll ever meet. To me, there's almost never a good time for war, but I would have voted to go after 9/11. But we had a vote, and it was nearly unanimous once again. But when we don't vote, we're not united as a nation. Republicans don't come together with Democrats, and we don't have that unity of purpose. We don't know whether we're fighting with one arm behind our back. We don't know whether a pilot's got to call a lawyer who calls a judge who calls another lawyer who calls the president to decide whether to drop a bomb. So we can't live like that, and we can't fight war like that, but we should debate it. So the president came to our caucus. There's about 50 Republicans, and we have lunch up there a couple times a week. The president came to our caucus, and I quoted back to him his quote, no president shall unilaterally go to war unless we're under imminent attack. And he says, well, there was an imminent attack occurring. There was a line of tanks from Gaddafi headed towards Benghazi, and there would have been a massacre. And I said, well, I thought when you said imminent attack, you meant us. How could the standard for going to war be that a president could go to war unilaterally if any foreign city were under attack? Not to mention the fact that many more people died because we went into there than the massacre that might have happened under Gaddafi. Who runs half of Libya now, or a third of Libya? ISIS. We are now bombing ISIS. We are bombing the replacement of the people we bombed. We bombed Gaddafi out of into the other world, probably that one, and then we're bombing ISIS now. We are in the midst of a war in Yemen, and most people have no idea. We are refueling the Saudi planes, we are picking the targets, and we have special forces on the ground helping the Saudis bomb Yemen. What is the problem with that? Well, it's a very confusing war. The people that they're supporting are Wahhabis, people who hate us, hate America, hate Christianity, hate women's rights, hate any kind of individual rights. That's who the Saudis are supporting. The other side are Houthi rebels supported by Iran. But who else is there? ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Perhaps once the chaos ensues, maybe the people that come out and are running the country when it's all said and done are ISIS. Do you know that out of the emails that were hacked of Podesta to Clinton, that there are emails showing that the Saudi Arabians were giving the weapons that we were selling them to ISIS? Podesta says to Clinton, if the American people discover that we're doing this, they'll be upset with us. Maybe we should say something to Saudi Arabia saying that they shouldn't be giving weapons to ISIS. But both Saudi Arabia and Qatar were giving weapons throughout the early part of the Civil War to ISIS.
And money to the Clinton Foundation.
We're fighting against ourselves too often. In one city north of Aleppo, in Morea, there was a story about 2 months ago. The Pentagon-supported Kurds, or Peshmerga, were fighting against the CIA-supported Syrian moderates. We literally were fighting ourselves. When the Turkish tanks rolled in, I mean the American tanks that the Turks have, rolled into Syria, do you know who their first shots were fired against? The Kurds, who are our friends. We've been giving weapons for years to Baghdad. Do you know who Baghdad's best friend is? Iran. Do you know who their second best friend is? Russia. Do you know who their third best friend is?
Syria.
Assad in Syria, aligned with Iran. We gave all the weapons to Baghdad, and they wouldn't give any good weapons to the Kurds because they're afraid of the Kurds taking over and having their own country. How do you avoid all of the messiness and murkiness and decide when we go to war? Vote on it. Debate it in the open, and Congress should decide when we go to war. We have to obey the Constitution. If we did, we'd find that things are so much better than they are at this time. when I look at all of it and I say, oh, well, or is everything terrible? No, I think sometimes we over-report the terrible and over-report the bad and don't really realize what a great country we live in. It is appalling to me to see people not standing during the pledge. Because the thing is, look, I am a critic. I'm a critic of our government. I am a dissenter. I think so many things are wrong, but I would never, ever, in my wildest dreams, think that I wouldn't stand for the pledge. America is the richest, the freest, and the most humanitarian nation ever known in the history of mankind. You can only be a humanitarian nation if you have great wealth. We have great wealth because of our freedom, because of our economic system, because of capitalism. And when I think about, and sometimes people are like, what about Clinton? What about Trump? I'm more worried that young people are succumbing to the nonsense of Bernie Sanders than anything else.
That's right.
Socialism is a system. Socialism is a system inherently dependent upon violence. It's not an accident that Stalin killed 37 million people. It's not an accident that Mao killed 60 million people. It is inherent to socialism. It is inherent to taking the choice away from people, even if it's a majority. Uncle Bernie says it's okay because the majority votes for it. Democratic socialism. It's still dependent on violence because they have to prevent you from selling what you want to sell to your neighbor, and they can only do that ultimately through violence. We're the richest, freest, most humanitarian nation on earth. I want to continue to fight to do what our founding fathers fought for, and that is to disperse power, to keep power from being centralized, and above all other duties, including defending the Constitution, which would include in this duty, I would say my duty is to defend your God-given liberty, and on that I will not compromise. Thank you.
Thank you.